As a native New Yorker, it pains me to say this, but Detroit style pizza is the best pizza on the market.
What did he say?
NYC, I'm sorry, in Chicago, no disrespect, but you don't even come close. I mean, nothing beats that sweet, delicious sauce, the saltiness from the cheese, and that crispy crust, unmatchable. Now, if you're thinking of using all-purpose flour for this recipe, then it serves no purpose. You need a flour with a high amount of gluten that can withstand the toppings that are put on this pizza. So I would highly recommend getting bread flour. I'm going to sift in 340 grams of bread flour, which is about 2 3/4 cups. Cups aren't always going to be accurate depending on how you pack it, but 340 grams will always be 340 grams if that makes sense. This is also in grams, and I'm adding about 6 grams of salt. Now after this, I'm going to throw in some yeast. I'm using instant yeast and I'm tossing in about 2 grams or a tablespoon of yeast. Lastly, this yeast needs to activate, and to do so, I'm going to toss in warm water, which is at about 88 degrees. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and add my hook attachment to my stand mixer, and I know there's going to be somebody in the comments going, "Yeah, I don't have a stand mixer, I can't make this." Daddy, chill. That's perfectly fine. You don't need to have a stand mixer. As you can see here, you can knead the dough by hand. It does get a little bit sticky icky, but if you have a well-oiled hand or a wet hand, you should be fine to make this dough at home. I don't want you feeling discouraged because you don't have certain tools, so just know whether it's shown in the video or discussed in the comments, I'll always find ways to make these recipes accessible to as many people as I can. Now I'm going to let that dough mix on low for about 2 or 3 minutes. This just gives the time for everything to get to know each other, to get those ingredients nice and mixed up. And then after that 2 or 3 minute time frame, I'm going to go ahead and let it rest for about 5 or 10 minutes. Now after it's done resting, I'm going to crank up the speed to about a 5 or a medium, and we're just going to let that set until all the ingredients combine and we get a nice sticky dough. Now at this point, what we're going to want to do is cover that and let that rest for about 30 minutes. Now while this may seem like a lot of resting, it's a crucial step in the process, so bear with me. After that dough finishes resting, I'm going to place some olive oil into a plastic bowl like so, and then I'm going to cover my dough and let it rise. Now if you don't have the time and patience to let this rise, I understand completely. You can let this rest for about 2 hours in a warm environment. Me personally, I want to let that flavor and crust develop, so I'm going to put this in the fridge, covered of course, for 24 to 48 hours. Alright, it's 24 hours later and the dough has slightly doubled in size, as you can see here. Oh, and before I forget, if you want to make this pizza, you're going to need the proper tools for it. I would personally recommend getting this Detroit style pizza pan. It's the standard pan for making all types of official Detroit style pizza. Because of this design, it allows the cheese to slide down to the crust and fry in that hot oil. Plus, this pan is super productive with conducting the heat at the bottom, so you get that next level crisp. I'll place a helpful link in the description below on how you can get one yourself. Now I'm going to coat the pan with some olive oil using a paper towel to brush it across. And just for additional flavor, this step is optional, but I highly recommend it. Take about 2 tablespoons of unsalted room temperature butter and just rub it across that pan. Now at this point, I'm going to use my well-oiled hands and press gently against the middle of that dough. I don't want to press against it too hard to break or compromise that dough's integrity, but the goal is to get that dough to cover up the entire pan and those corners. And when we reach the point where that dough is giving us resistance and snapping back like Beyonce after a pregnancy, the next thing we want to go ahead and do is we're going to let it rest once again. And while it rests, I'm going to begin the next step, which is making my sauce. Now I use the Cento brand whenever I make my sauces, from pizza sauce to homemade pasta sauce for chicken parmesan, spaghetti, you name it. I'm going to quickly chop up some fresh garlic cloves, about 4 or 5 of them, and finally mince it until it gets like this. Now to a pan on medium-low heat, I'm going to take about 2 tablespoons of olive oil, and then I'm going to add my minced garlic before that pan gets too hot. I want to make sure that this garlic cooks, but it doesn't burn. Now after I add my canned crushed tomatoes, let's give it some seasoning to add some flavor to that sauce. First we're going to add 2 teaspoons of garlic powder, then we'll add 1 teaspoon of fine Italian seasoning. Next I added about another teaspoon of fresh dried basil, then I added 2 tablespoons of granulated sugar, and then to top it off, I added a little bit of Flora and Mana all-purpose seasoning. Now they're not sponsoring this video by any means, I just happen to love their use of natural ingredients in their seasonings. I'll put a helpful link in the description below if you're interested in supporting them like I do. And I'm going to turn the heat down to low, so this should simmer for about 20 or 25 minutes. So you want to stir occasionally so it goes from a runny sauce until it gets slightly thick, just like this. Now this is thick enough to lose any moisture, as we don't want a wet runny sauce. And of course you want to put your big chef hat on, so make sure you taste this to adjust for any seasonings. Tastes great in my book, so let's move on and press our dough a second time. Now by this time our dough should be proofed enough to stretch to all corners of the pizza pan. So like before, with an oiled hand, gently press down, and by this time the dough should be proofed enough so this way you'll be able to get the dough in the corners. And please do not forget this step, but make sure you cover it and let it rest for another 30 minutes, and by that time that dough should be ready to partially bake. But before we do that, let's get some pep sliced up. Now this is deli style pepperoni that you can find in your grocer's deli counter. I would highly recommend getting this type of pepperoni and not the ones that you get in the bag, as those are super oily and may burn in that high heat pan. I'm going to start by chopping my peps up, and I'm going to place my pizza stone in my 500-degree oven so I can make sure that not only do I get that pizza cooked properly, but that bottom gets a little more help when heating up and gives me that perfect crispy crust guaranteed. Now we're almost there, my friends. We're at the home stretch, but now I have to shred my cheese. Now real Detroit style pizza requires Wisconsin brick cheese, but I live on the East Coast and I'm not paying to have all that cheese shipped to me. So as a viable substitute, I'm shredding 3 other types of cheese. I'm using Monterey Jack cheese, white cheddar cheese, and fresh whole milk low moisture mozzarella. And this is a nice combination of richness and meltability, and personally, it tastes great. And now after the final proof, I'm going to give this one last spread before I place this in my oven to partially bake. And because of that pizza stone, it's already where it needs to be at the 5-minute mark, and now I can begin to top it. I'm going to start with 4 pepperonis at each endpoint and then making sure I have rows of 6. By doing this, I can guarantee that each slice will have an even 4 slices of peps. Now if you look closely, I'm adding the cheese to my corners first. Because of the design of this pan, all that cheese is going to slide to the sides and cook in that oil, but it's going to hold up so you get that nice crispy salty cheesy crust. Then by design, we're going to take our sauce and add 3 lines across the sides of each pepperoni. Then we're going to finish baking in the oven for about 10 or 12 minutes until it looks just like this.
Perfect.
And you know what? It's done. When that cheese is nice and melty, the crispy cheese develops on the sides, and that crust is nice, brown, and crispy, you know you have a fully authentic Detroit style pizza. Now once it stops sizzling, you can take a spatula and pop it out on its sides before placing it onto a cutting board and cutting it in 6 equal pizzas. I topped it with some fresh basil. Get a look at that gorgeous slice, and now that we're caught in 4K, let's get to eating.
First of all, immediate crisp on that crust. That cheese blends in perfectly. The sauce is nice and sweet. You see that the dough is nice and soft in the middle. I say this is a win.
And there you have it, my friends, Detroit style pizza. Thank you once again for supporting my channel. If you want the full recipe, please check out the link in the description below. Make sure you subscribe to get more recipes like these. And until the next time we feast, peace.